Hello and welcome. My name is Brian. I'm an industrial designer here at the Barber Vintage Motorsports Museum. Very happy to be here tonight. I'm joined by Pierre Terblanche.
Hi guys. I'm visiting on holiday, and I'm just looking at visiting the museum, and I had the opportunity to come and talk about the development of the Supermono and some bits and pieces.
Well, we're honored to have you here while you're in town. So before we get to the Supermono, which we have behind us, this is one of our bikes from the collection. We've been doing a design study on the bike, so we've taken some parts off and thought that would be cool to show you all. Yeah. But before we get to that, let's talk a little bit about your background, how you got into design, and where you're from, and a little bit of your story.
Yeah, I'm 64 now, so I actually had to make some notes to figure out what I'd done. I kind of forget. I'm from South Africa, and I grew up in a small town called Uitenhage, which had a VW factory. My dad was a carpenter, and I grew up in a model shop. So when I was young, I had next door neighbors that actually the father of my buddies raced Nortons and things. So I learned about bikes there. My dad didn't know the front end from the back end of the bike. So that was kind of interesting. After high school, I studied graphic design in Port Elizabeth, joined an advertising agency, worked there for about 6 years. Then I decided to become a designer. I visited Europe after meeting Giorgetto Giugiaro. Went to visit him in Italy. After that, I went to Ford of Germany. I got lucky. I was sponsored to do a 2-year master's degree at Royal College of Art. After that, I went to Volkswagen Design in Düsseldorf, where I stayed for 3 years. Then I went to Ducati, which was my passion. Went to do bikes. Worked with Massimo Tamburini. From the Ducati design in Rimini, I went up to Varese, to CRC, to the Cagiva Design Center, where this bike was done, the Mono. Back to Ducati in Rimini. After that, I joined Ducati in Bologna, where I did all the rest of my Ducati work. After that, I took a break. I did some work for Moto Guzzi with Miguel Galuzzi, who did the Monster. After the Guzzi stuff, I worked briefly for Norton until I woke up and realized it was maybe not the greatest ideas we've seen. Then I worked I was consulted for a big Japanese OEM for a while. Headed for Alabama, worked for Confederate Motorcycle, which when I realized I met Brian and I saw the museum, then Royal Enfield. I stayed there for a while. I was actually meant to work on another project, not the general design work for Royal Enfield. And when the project stopped, I decided that I didn't want to work on retro bikes anymore, and I took off. I worked on an electric bike in South Africa, the BST Hypersport, for almost 18 months, almost 2 years. And while I was also doing consulting work for an Asian OEM. And that brings us to today. So I'm here on holiday, hanging out, and be very honored to be here.
Well, we thank you for being here. It's an impressive career. You've been in design for a long time.
Yeah. Like 40 years.
Yeah. So let's talk about the Supermono.
Okay, so the Supermono was my first all-complete bike I designed.
This was at
that was in Varese. Was Varese at Cagiva up in Morazzone in Varese. Okay. Where I worked, and before this I had done the Pazzo facelift and the Ducati 888. So when this came up, it was kind of a tough project, because they rolled up one day and said, okay, cool, you got 3 months, we've got the Cologne show, do a bike. Here's a chassis, go for it. So, of course, that's a bit of a big ask. So we designed the bike, did all the clay modeling, all the fiberglass work, all the design work in 3 months, and got the bike to the show somehow. A little bit about the bike. It's kind of unique in single cylinders in that it's actually a twin in a way. And it's, I don't know if people know how the twin came about. Ducati had a single, didn't have enough horsepower, they added a cylinder. So with a mono, they just took a cylinder away again and went back to where they started. So it was a very, very interesting bike with a great balancing system, which allowed the bike to rev to about 11,000 RPM. And they kind of cleaned up when the racing started.
So developed for racing.
Developed for, well, not purely developed for race, it was actually meant to be a road bike. So some of the details of the bike were actually not that optimized for racing, like the air intake in the front nose, because we had to leave space for the lights. Unfortunately, due to whatever politics or decision was made higher up in the company, they never built the bike. So it only remained as the 67 or 68 or whatever the Italians decided on the day how many they made. And so now the bike is very rare, and I think one went for about $220,000 recently. So
yeah,
it's become very, very sought after.
So total of about 67 made from 1993 to 1997. Yeah. It's a 550cc four-stroke Desmo 4-valve based on the 888 engine at the time, which was championship-winning V-twin design. It's 6-speed dry clutch, trellis steel frame. Talk a little bit about the frame, the chassis, the engine, the different groups.
I'll talk about the general layout of the bike though. I mean, engineer Bordi, who was my boss, with the help of Gianluigi Mengoli, designed the motor, and the motor's unique in that it has a balance lever called a Batacchio linked to the rear cylinder.
And what is Batacchio?
Batacchio is like a hammer or a lever, and instead of having a balanced piston, they have a balanced lever. So in there is a lever that goes up and down with a connecting rod, and that makes it vibrate exactly like a V-twin. And that allows it also to rev to about 11,000 RPM. So it wasn't like the normal single cylinders with a counterbalance and so on that vibrated itself to pieces. So they got more power out of it, and it's pretty light. So, and the crankcases are made for a V-twin, so it's understressed, so it's pretty reliable. Okay, so the guys that worked on the bike was Mengoli on the engine department, Bordi, who's the head of engineering. We had Dominic Cali, we had Franco Farnay, who passed away a few years ago, who was the head of a race department at the time. And in there somewhere there's a model maker called Bruno Grossi, who had big hair. So I hadn't looked at the photographs for many years, so to me it's also kind of a revelation and brings back a lot of memories.
You just recently went through all these photos, right?
Yeah, I found the photographs in my storeroom, so I found them and I pulled them out, and we're using one or two of them for the presentation. So I hadn't seen them for a long, long time. Yeah. The bike was done 29 years ago, so I was a little bit younger and more optimistic and more energetic then.
So a lot of this is, you're going through a box of old photos. You're holding these parts that you haven't touched for 29 years. What's that like?
I looked at the stuff and I realized, I remembered how we'd done them, and I'm actually tired once again because it was a lot of hard work. And what people have to realize, this was analog, pre-computer, so zero computer, they didn't exist. We did everything by hand, so the bike was modeled in clay. We had to make the tools, model the bike, then make it symmetrical by hand, which is a huge task. And then we had to take all the molds, make all the parts, paint them, get the carbon fiber made, which was new for us. So I had to go to Slovenia, to a place called near Bled, to get that made. And we had very, very sophisticated sort of technology to make sure they didn't break. So when the first one broke, we just added some more resin, and that's what we had.
So the clay, you've got a stand, you've got a platform, you've got a chassis and a motor mock-up. You're putting clay, you're doing styling on one side. You've got you analog copy points. Talk about that a little bit.
So this is what I was handed, more or less. I had to modify the frame so that the injection system fitted. The steering head was modified so that we could get the air past it. All the bracketry on there we added to fit the bodywork, and then we had to make an armature in wood that fitted on the chassis. We covered that with clay, and then everything was modeled by hand. It's just basically a sculptural approach. So did some sketches, modeled it up, and then when we had the left-hand side finalized, we had to then copy it on the other side by hand.
And there's no computer at this point.
No, it's unbelievable, but no computers.
Yeah.
We did it like they did the Boeing or the space shuttle, all on a drawing board. A guy called Franco Bilancioni did the frame design, and that was done on a big drawing board. So it was all done by hand. I received the frame. I mean, there were some odd things on it. The exhaust is on the left-hand side, which today, knowing a bit more than I did then, I would have put on the right-hand side. So it wasn't under the chain, and we can pull it in like a little with a gull wing, with a gull wing swing arm. But as I said, it was one of my first projects, so I was a bit ignorant as well, so I didn't know.
And
along with the whole team.
The timeline. The timeline was to get to Cologne.
The timeline, we had 3 months to get to Cologne.
Yeah.
So, and
this would have been 1992, October
1992.
of 92,
Yeah,
fall of
the
92.
show was October 92. And it was actually presented exactly the same show as the Monster. So Miguel's Monster was on the next table.
Which is crazy.
Kind of a long time ago.
Yeah, but you're both there side by side.
Yeah, we
with
were there
these concept bikes.
yeah.
The Monster, of course, came out in '93. The Supermono simultaneously.
Yeah, it came out in '93 as well.
Yeah.
So,
Wow.
so the big thing about this is actually about how things have changed. This is really the way that things were done till probably even 4 or 5 years after the mono.
Yeah.
Sort of 98, 99, we started using computers for the first time.
Right.
Until then, everything was done from master models. There were no computer models made for tooling or anything. They were all done by hand.
Right.
And it sounds a bit odd, but that's the way that everything was made. Not only motorcycles, everything.
Right. So you've got Supermono in '92. You're doing the Supermono design, the bulk of it in '92. You've got the Super Sport in '98.
'98, yeah.
Still no computer, or
we started on the Super Sport. We used, I think, 3 softwares through the process because the first company failed dismally.
So you're kind of experimenting.
We were experimenting with it because that was the
tools-
first time, and that was 3D CAD. We did actually use 2D CAD microsystem a little bit earlier, but it was only 2D. We didn't have 3D. So the first bike with 3D CAD was the Super Sport.
Yeah.
But partially. We didn't have the mechanical bits on there.
Yeah.
And the 999 was the first all 3D CAD model
Which was
did.
right after that, 98.
Which was
started-
after that,
Yeah, yeah.
And that was a big experiment because everything we had to be modeled up. There was no library, we had no idea. And also the softwares are kind of new to everybody, and it was all a new world for us.
Yeah. So back to the clay. So you're modeling the clay, you're doing the styling. There was not going to be any computer digitizing of that.
No.
So everything you did, you had an eye towards needing to copy it over to the other side, make adjustments for non-symmetrical features or so forth. And then you get to the point where, all right, you're happy with it. You need to start making parts, right?
Yeah, I mean, the model making took a while. It was actually very hot that summer. So the clay kind of, at about 30, 32 degrees, the clay would be very soft, almost like ice cream. And we had about 38 degrees in the studio. So it's not, we don't have soft shapes because of the clay, because the clay was soft, but it was kind of tough.
This is standard plasticine styling clay.
It was,
so
it was cold clay.
Yeah.
It was cold clay, yeah. And what it is you heat up clay in an oven, and then you apply it, and it's supposed to harden, except in the Italian summer. We had no aircon either, so aircon was like a dream. We literally had 38 degrees, what's that, 100, 110 for Americans, and about 80-90% humidity. So it was kind of, they were long days.
Yeah.
And of course everything had to be made by hand. So we had to make sure that all the draft angles were correct, that you could mold stuff. So it's a good learning curve.
And so you're pulling molds off of sections. You've broken up the design into panels. You're pulling molds off of some sections. You've got to move clay out of the way and
to make the next part. So we did the complete body work. We took molds of the tailpiece. Then we had to cut that all away, Then we cleaned up the subframe and the saddle. Then we took molds of the saddle. Then we had to take the saddle away, clean up the base of it, and then we made the subframe.
Yeah.
And then we made a mold in fiberglass.
This is one of the. This is the piece from this
so
bike.
Basically, what we did is this all had to be. That was all modeled. So we took a mold of all this, took that all away. Then we did this part of the seat. Then went down with a drill, drilled in 10, 15 mil all around to give us a guide. Put Tipex in there, which is white correction fluid for other countries who don't use Tipex. And then we modeled that down, and then we had the subframe. So the subframe was then modeled and then molded.
Yeah.
And then this went to the carbon fiber supplier who took molds to make his part.
Yeah.
So it's unlike what you do today. Today it would be kind of nice. You know, it's air-conditioned comfort and you can do it all on CAD.
Yeah.
And of course it's very precise. This bike is not totally symmetrical. It can't be. So it's out by a few mil here and there, like most race bikes or handmade bikes were at the time.
Yeah.
So it's not perfect.
You went to a wind tunnel, right?
Yeah, years later we went to the wind tunnel, not at the time.
Mm-hmm.
When we did the 999, we tested it in the wind tunnel, the MV Augusta wind tunnel for their helicopters.
Okay.
Yeah. So, which was interesting. It was actually quite good for something that was totally kind of just done by suck and see method. We didn't have CFD. We had suck and see. So, you know, so it was kind of the old way.
Right. So, you know, let's talk about, you know, the tank, for instance. You know, that the part that you have there, how those parts fit in. You're designing.
So the tank, the airbox bolts to the frame.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it goes on the top of the frame,
mm-hmm.
and we had a conical section in there, and then the tank slides into the airbox to hold it on.
Yeah.
And you've got your screw mounting on the back of it.
Yeah.
And then your subframe goes on top. So this can come off quite easily.
And that's one of my favorite features of the complete bike.
Yeah,
you could have just as easily covered the airbox and.
Well, yeah. Well, when I looked at it, I thought that it didn't make a lot of sense to cover the airbox because I think this is probably one of the first bikes where the airbox stuck through the frame, through the tank.
Yeah, it's really nice.
And it kind of designed itself because you wouldn't make quite often you'd have a top of the tank about 10 mil thick to
mm-hmm.
cover it.
Yeah.
But this one I thought it would be a nice feature just it sticking through.
Yeah.
So that was kind of cool. And the bike had a kind of a designed line to it, which was a graphic shut line which ran through the tailpiece and through the tank. Yeah,
there's definitely a language to the design that you see, you know, in something like the 999, which is almost a decade later.
Yeah.
But you see the start. This is obviously, you know, is a predecessor to the 916. So that era for you.
Yeah, I mean, I really like the classic Italian show cars, you know, from Pininfarina, Bertoni, and so on. And they actually incredibly simple. So I wanted to do a shape which was very simple and elegant. So that was the idea, you know. As a designer, you can only do the best you can at the time. So this was the best I could get done.
Yeah.
So we talked about the road part of it. On the fairing, this actually was meant to hinge up to get service things underneath, and then the headlamps were going to go here. And that's why the air intake was higher up. And this obviously, what the race guys found out later, this is not the best place to put the air intake. The air intake should really be in the high pressure area. So that's one of those things that I didn't know. Mm-hmm. I mean, you know, we didn't have all the clever software around at the time. So if one had to do one now, obviously the intakes would be in a different place.
And the slots, where did you get the slots from?
They are Italian.
Typical.
They typical Italian design slots. They are from Pininfarina. They've used them on a lot of cars. The Ferrari Dino 246 has them on the bonnet. I just like them. So nothing like having a little element you can put in there. We're both there on the fairing sides as well.
seeing these parts here, we talk a lot about this analog design, moving to CAD in recent years. It's interesting to me that you're able to hold these parts now, and it brings back memories, but you physically have the photos of it. Whereas you talk about the BST bike, in 10 years, if you want to go back and look at that bike, you're going to pull up CAD files.
Yeah, I wouldn't have photographs, but I'd have screenshots of all the phases.
Yeah.
So it's kind of similar.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not very different working on CAD. In a way, you can mock stuff up in CAD as well. You don't have to do a drawing of the whole thing beforehand. You can kind of develop it as you go along.
Right.
Be more of a maker rather than a stylist or designer. So you can kind of make things as you go along, and they kind of, there's a happy accident, and you think, wow, if I change this over here, it'll look cool. May not be on your drawing, but then drawings are two-dimensional.
Yeah.
Quite often now, you get the guys from the marketing department that used to work for, Procter & Gamble. They'll come and they want to see a side view, a three-quarter view, and then you've got to make the bike. It may not look that great in real life, but that's what they've seen. And some companies actually now go and they'll do the full-size drawing, do the bike, it'll be modified, and then they'll update the drawing to match the bike they've done, so management don't feel threatened. So it's kind of a fake thing a little bit. Mm-hmm. People do clay models after they've done the bike now to act like they've done them that way, but it's kind of weird.
Yeah.
This was it was a simpler time. We just did the bikes.
Yeah,
we just made them.
I know in recent years you see some car companies coming out saying we're doing away with clay. We're going and they come back to it, or
Yeah, I mean, I think Renault design tried to do away with clay, but what most companies do now is they would they do the sketches, they would design the car in CAD, they'd machine it out in clay, then they would go and model the clay, they'd finalize the clay model, scan it back in, then they'll do the Class A services, machine a master model, paint and sign that off, and then they'll go to production. Mm-hmm. So they've kind of gone back on themselves a little bit. Until we have a better way to judge 3 dimensions, it's not that easy, because on a screen the thing is only about this big.
Yeah.
You don't see the full volume, you can't really stand on it. And now we have, you have the VR goggles. I believe a friend of mine from ex-MV Agusta, Adrian Morton, swears by it. He says it's as a great benefit. I've not really used it, but he says you get a good feel for the bike in virtual reality.
Yeah.
So I think technology will change and become better. But there's nothing like sitting on the bike.
Right.
Literally have it there.
Yeah. Yeah, you can't replace that. You can have newer tools, but nothing will replace a physical model. We may have faster ways to get to that physical
get to the
model.
Yeah. And what would be better now today, you'd have a perfectly symmetrical bike. All the details will be perfect. You'd have a perfect gap between panels. All the fixing points will be perfect. But there's something to be said about modeling something up, like a sculpture, and figuring it out.
Yeah. And now you can have parts in 24 hours. And
yeah, I mean this part was done. We had to do a wooden model of it, then take a mold, and then it had to be molded. Mm-hmm. But if you did this on CAD, this part on CAD would probably take a couple of hours.
Yeah.
And then you feed it into a rapid prototype machine, and the next morning it'll be done.
Yeah.
And you can fit it and try it and whatever else. So things have improved and changed, and it's much easier in some ways.
Yeah.
Definitely a lot less tiring.
So talk about that moment, when you're getting nearing to completion of the project. There's 8 to 10 people on the team. You're going to Cologne. What was that like?
Yeah, well,
getting to the show.
We had the people involved here were probably 3 or 4 people in Ducati itself. So I wasn't working in Bologna. We had 4 people working on the bike in Varese, Morazzone. We had 2 model makers. Stefano Budelli was Bruno Grossi. We had an Aussie guy called Steve. Hi, Steve. I don't know where you are, so contact the museum, and I haven't seen you for all those years. And it was myself. So a small group of people doing a lot of work. So we had a lot of fun, got very hot and tired, and the bike was a great success. Our boss, Castiglione, loved it. And then we had to get it to the show, which was quite a story in itself. But
you were telling me that the paint was
still
drying on the way there.
We did all the work in primer in Varese. We drove the bike to Bologna, and our main paint supplier painted it for us. But the paint was still wet, so we had to put the bodywork panels were hung in boxes on wires, and we put it in the back of the van so they could dry on the way to Germany. And they gave me a driver that couldn't speak English, had never left Italy, and he was supposed to take the bike all the way to Cologne. So I said, no way, it's not going to happen. So I drove with him, and it was I thought about it today for the first time in 30 years almost. The van's rear lights were broken, so I had to steal one off Franco Forne's race truck. So I took his lights off, put on my truck, and then we drove to Switzerland, and they blocked me at the border saying the van has to be sealed. So I drove back to the studio, got a drilled holes in the door.
Like
had to be sealed with wires and a seal, yeah. So I had to go and drill holes in the door, and then we drove all the way up to Cologne. And of course, no GPS.
Was it snowing? Was it snowing too?
It wasn't snowing, though. It was cold and dark and miserable, so no GPS, but a bit of common sense. So I just found a taxi driver and said, lead the way to the hotel. So he just drove in front of us, and next morning we went to the show.
I'm just curious, did Miguel have all this trouble getting the monster to the show? Or?
No, I think Miguel flew. If Miguel's listening, hi Miguel, I think Miguel flew, and the monster had been done previously. So the monster was up there in great comfort. He just showed up. We assembled the bike on the show stand with hot glue, body filler, duct tape or whatever, and about 10 minutes before the show started, the bike was there. So
that's just the way it is. I've tried to tell people that well, it'd be nice to be there early, but it doesn't seem to ever
well,
happen
if
that
management
way.
had asked us, the 3 months could have been started 6 months before, but it seems to be a managerial problem. Sorry guys, all the designers out there, has your management ever asked you to do the show bike the year before? Because the shows are every year the same time, but the program starts 3 months before the show, right? So there we are.
There'll be much rejoicing out there.
Yeah, sorry guys, and it will never change, never.
So you made it to the show.
We made it to the show, and the bike was kind of really, really well received, and everybody was extremely happy. And then, unfortunately, we didn't go and build it as a road bike. So of course, if it's worth $200,000 now, if I'd bought one, that would have been kind of cool.
It's been a good investment, yeah.
It was. I was going to buy a road one, and it never happened. So
so could this bike be made today? You wouldn't do the same process, right?
I mean, the process would be different, but if you go according to the route we did with that, if you take a 1299 Panigale and you remove a cylinder, you'd end up with a similar bike. You'd get about probably 105 horsepower out of it. Probably can get the weight down with a bit of luck to about 105, 110 kilos.
This was 57, 58 horsepower?
This was 57 horsepower, the first ones. With the Testostretto motor, the later guys got about 90, 93 horsepower out of them. But I think half a Panigale, if I'm not mistaken, probably give you about 105 horsepower.
Yeah.
So it will be a bit quick.
Yeah.
And light.
This one was 277 pounds dry, 4 gallons of fuel, top speed of about 140.
Probably get about 260 pounds-ish.
Yeah.
I don't know about pounds, it's a bit archaic for us. I come from South Africa, sorry guys.
Sorry, 125 kilo.
125, yeah. You could probably get 10 kilos off that, or less, or more. But 110 kilos, I guess it's easily done, maybe 105.
Yeah. What would you have done differently at that time with the tools that you had?
No, I mean, this was what we did at the time. This was all I knew, and this was a standard way of doing the bikes. So nothing we did was special. It was just the same way that everybody worked. So you just made your models. Oh, the bike was actually the central line of the bike. Today you do a scan. I asked the guys to get me the centerline section of a 250 race bike. So we had a Aprilia and a Yamaha.
Centerline, as you're modeling.
Just the profile.
Why is that important?
Centerline section. So we had a red line, or I don't know, red line on the top for the Aprilia, a blue line at the bottom, and we put a green line in the middle, and that's the bike. So that was we knew we were right to split the difference.
Yes.
So
those were the benchmark bikes.
those were the
because
benchmark bikes. It
for
was
the,
meant to be a 250 GP with a 4-stroke motor.
Yeah.
That's why it's actually quite a small bike. You know, short wheelbase, quite tiny really. It's very, very small, the tank. But these dimensions were all from a 250. Later we found that the Supermono riders were actually quite big and chunky. I think the average height I measured at Misano was about 5'10". So they were actually bigger than needed. So a lot of people raised the bike, they raised the saddle, so they could kind of ride it more easily.
Yeah, very short.
Short wheelbase.
Short wheelbase. About 3.5 inches of trail.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you know, if you look at it now, it's kind of crude and simple in a way.
The frame was all handmade.
Oh yeah, I mean the frame's hand welded, TIG welded, and it's actually very light. It's about I think it's 6.2 kilos, which is pretty light for a frame. And at the time, it was thought that it had to be quite stiff. Nobody kind of talked about frame flex. You know, frame flex is something that came later with the Japanese. And we use this. The radiator is the same one as used on 916.
Magnesium covers, engine covers.
There were magnesium covers. The clutch cover was quite an interesting story about how it was made. We didn't have a lathe, so we had a vertical drill press. So I put a bolt through a bit of wood and I put it vertically, and I turned it sideways, so you kind of improvised just to get it done.
And that was the pattern for the carbon.
That was a pattern to make the mold. Yeah. And the first one, the guys forgot to put in the release agent, so the mold stuck to it, so we had to do it again, which made me really happy. Anyway.
The ECU, where did that come from?
The ECU, I think it was a Fiat 128.
Car
Stuff. Yeah. I mean, you know, this small company. I mean, they were making what?
It's sizable.
7,000 motorcycles a year.
Right.
So they just bought stuff off the shelf.
Yeah.
No, it's still the same today. A lot of the electronics just come from car stuff. That's why it's big and chunky. You know, it's very, very clumsy. And the typical parts been Marcazzini wheels, Brembo disc brakes, and Öhlins forks, Öhlins shock.
Yeah.
Termignoni exhaust.
A lot of little handmade parts on this. The carbon parts, the foot peg brackets are solid carbon.
Yeah.
A lot of very interesting little parts that all had to be hand fabricated to make this work.
Yeah, I mean you know, it's really kind of it's a race bike, so it's all kind of handmade. And the guys who made the carbon fiber stuff did that for us in as I said, in Slovenia, and there's a company called it's called Mislav Zornik, and they make really fantastic calipers now. They make carbon disc brakes. They've got a fantastic facility, and this stuff was made in a shed where they actually had newspapers in the holes in the wall. So it was a long time ago. So they also developed way beyond where we started.
Yeah. Yeah, that tail section alone is an impressive piece. Structural carbon fiber.
Yeah. I mean, the subframe, you know, that's not very different from what they do now.
Yeah, but this is 1992.
Yeah. Oh, and the people still do it the same way. They make them in carbon fiber, and when they break, they add a few stickers. So it's kind of, sorry, carbon fiber guys, but it seems to be very hard to calculate everything.
Let's talk about the place, Barber. This is where we're at.
Barber.
What inspires you here?
Well, if you like bikes or design, I mean, there are 1,000 bikes up here. If you walk in here, the first thing is that you actually get overwhelmed. And my first time I had to leave after a couple of hours and just go. And it takes a couple of days to kind of digest and then come back. And I've probably been here about 20 times. And every time I see something new.
Yeah.
I believe there are 1,000 bikes displayed at the moment. Another 600, another 600 in the storage area waiting to be restored, 58 Lotus cars, and I think 158 total cars. So it's big, and it's spectacular and mind-blowing, really.
Yeah.
Any designer that wants to see the history of design should really visit. It's absolutely fantastic.
Yeah.
You know, I don't think there's anything better in the world. You know, unfortunately, I think the one in Austria burned down a couple of nights ago,
Yeah.
which is kind of sad.
Yeah.
Birmingham, England, funnily enough, is the other one, and that's got mostly British bikes. That's also really cool to visit. But there's nothing like this anywhere in the world.
That's really, I think, what hit me early on when I was just getting into having an interest in motorcycle design was when I came here, and I could see just from the architecture of the building, where you could see everything, and you can be standing up on, you know, the different mezzanines and be looking down, and the way it was laid out, I think, was brilliant, and it just allows you to see the entire history in one view.
Yeah.
And for a designer, when you can sit here and just sketch and see, you know, everything that's been tried, and there's you know, all kinds of stories in here of things that worked and didn't work, and commercial successes, commercial failures, and so forth, and you can see it all at once.
You know, I mean, it's really if you're a student of history, especially for motorcycles, this is the place to come. There are so many variations of every component. You talk about foot pegs or fork legs or triple clamps or handlebar grips or whatever.
Yeah.
It is absolutely amazing. I mean, it's just, and the ideas in here that are so clever that if you did them today, you get a design prize for them. But they were probably done in 1922 or 58 or 63 or whatever. And they're hidden up there somewhere, and you've got to go and look.
Yeah.
So for the generation where, unfortunately, now we're doing like a curating of versions of stuff that was made in the 60s and 70s, these guys innovated all the time, and some of them worked, some didn't, but they were doing new stuff all the time. So it's really worth a visit. I would recommend to any bike fan or designer should really come here. Just come visit.
Yeah.
Yeah, Engineer Bordy was a guy in charge. He chose to keep the horizontal cylinder, and I think what happened was the choice at the time. People had the idea that you had to have a low center of gravity. That may have been a thing. Other bikes have been done like this. That Yamaha and a few Rumi have done horizontal motors. Yeah. Actually, horizontal motors make a lot more sense than the vertical ones. But everybody just makes them like they did in 1932. They choose a vertical cylinder, and that, of course, then your airbox, cylinder, and everything sits in the middle of all the place we have to put the other stuff, which we've got now. Airboxes, canisters, batteries, electronics, whatever else. And that's why the bikes have got a lot bigger and clumsier. So it was whether it was an inspired choice or just a bit of chance, but it's actually a very good layout.
Yeah. And the racers who rode them and in competition talked about how, you know, how it handled.
Yeah, I mean, they actually had to, some people raised the center of gravity. They raised the motor up a little bit, the whole bike, jacked it up like 20, 25 mil. But the bike is, some people claim it's one of the best bikes they've ever ridden, handling-wise. So, you know, it's great. It's a great layout. Yeah,
and there's so many. You know, I've had the time to kind of study this in the past few weeks, which is it's just been really inspiring. But then you go back into the history of the museum, and you see these little nuggets of you know, design machines that have this kind of the horizontal layout, and it just makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I mean the Moto Guzzi, Carcano was one of the top engineers of all times. He did the Moto Guzzi single races, and they were horizontals. So they were super lightweight, and they were fantastic motors. As I said, Rumi, Yamaha, a lot of people have done it.
We have several Rumis now.
Yeah.
They are so cool.
Yeah.
I really think that there's a lot of interesting
and of course the AJS Porcupine, which is one of my favorites.
Yeah.
That's also a little bit angled, but it's also a horizontal motor. So yeah. No, I just was handed a frame and exhaust system, and I had to put the bodywork on. So I had to make sure that everything fitted, so I made some modifications. Like in the front of the frame, the airbox didn't fit well, so we bent the tube a little bit and tweaked a few things. I had to put on all the mounting brackets and stuff, but that was basically where my task ended. I didn't do anything to the frame. I don't actually remember the Super Son of Singles series, but it was a race series for single-cylinder bikes, and it lasted quite a long time. I mean, 6, 7, 8 years maybe. And I know that Engineer Bordi scolded some of the younger engineers. I won't mention the name because he's in charge now, but they told him to lose some revs to not wipe out the other competitors. It was a bit unfair because it was an official works bike rather than a home-built special. So they actually took some revs away so they wouldn't run away with the races completely. But it was extremely successful for a long, long time. Would Ducati make a single-cylinder bike? Well, it depends what Claudio Domenicali wants to do and what their marketing department decides. Maybe. I mean, you know, the world market seems to be looking at smaller bikes. I personally believe it would have been a perfect thing to do anyway 10, 15 years ago. The choices were made, and you know, Ducati is selling very high-end bikes, but they're quite limited in production.
Yeah, it really is amazing that, you know, we got the restoration team to pull some of your other designs out, and I wanted it in the chronological design order, right? So the 999 should really be on the far end, right?
Yeah.
But they were done at the same.
Yeah, funnily enough, the MHE was done, that was my weekend job. That was done at the same time as the 999, and that was done in the UK. And then the 999 came later, and then a few years later we did the Sport Classics range. They unfortunately were dropped from production.
So the MH900E led to the Sport Classics?
No, they were all done at the same time.
At the same time.
So I did 4 or 5 bikes at the same time.
Yeah.
But because, just an anecdote, 3 months before the Munich show, DPG realized they hadn't got anything to show. They didn't have a bike, so they gave me 3 months to do the bike. That was another.
3 months to do the
MHE was done in 3 months. Yeah, it was a lot of fun, and that was done weekends and evenings. And that was another thank you management moment. But yeah, the bike wasn't really done in 3 months. I'd been working on sketching it for about 12 years. So I pulled out my sketchbooks and stuff, and we went and built the bike. Oh, no doubt about it.
What do you like?
Today.
You
Air
like
conditioned, comfort, computer, you could sit at the coffee shop. I prefer the way that things are developed today. This was a great moment, but I really like the way things are done now. I don't think it influences it's not about the design methodology, it's about the effort you put in. So there's no reason why with the methods of today you can do a better job than before.
Yeah.
You just have to put the work in.
Well, it's amazing work. We're really glad to have one here. I'm really glad too, and I got to see it with all the body off, and it's been really fun.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have never seen it with the body off, not much. And it's pretty simple. It's a simple bike and very essential. I actually think that the latest electric bike I've done, the BST Hypertech, is probably the most resolved, most complete bike I've done. And it should be. That's the most experienced I've been. I did that a couple of years ago. So this was at the beginning of my career, and it was kind of a difficult one because people liked it so much that after that you could only fail. But I think that the BST Hypertech is probably the best thing I've ever done.
This was all electric.
All electric, all new, and I did all the work myself, and we could do the layout and really, and all done on CAD, by the way. So it was, and all the parts were rapid prototype or CNC machines, so it's all perfect. There's no flaws to it.
Yeah.
You may like the design or not, but the parts are perfectly resolved.
Yeah. Well, I think that concludes this talk of the Supermono. We're very thankful for Pierre and his time, telling us a little bit of the backstory to it, and thank you.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you for watching.
And thanks for your time.